Hello and welcome to the Events Podcast, where we help you build your events empire by building profitable events while having fun at the same time. So we've had a bit of a break over the summer, really since the start of the year. I was really busy with my company Apps Events during the pandemic. I talked about that on the last call with James. We transitioned to doing a lot of work for Google, running a lot of online events, doing different stuff. So I was just really busy, but I've really missed doing the Events Podcast, and we're still getting great views. We're actually a top 10% of all podcasts in the world still, which is amazing, as it's a very niche thing. But I want to say a couple of things. Firstly, if you enjoyed the podcast, please get in touch with me. Most people don't give me any feedback, and getting feedback really encourages me to make more episodes. Just email me at dan@appsevents.com, dan@appsevents.com. Even better, if you can give us a review anywhere you listen to the podcast. Please stop right now in iTunes, Spotify, Pocket Cast, wherever you are, and please leave us a review, if possible 5 stars of course, would be great. Back to the podcast. So we really focus on helping event entrepreneurs run amazing events, and that could be people who run events companies, but also just as many people, maybe more, are entrepreneurs who just run events as part of their business. They might run events to promote something else, they might run meetups, they might run one big conference a year. This is the kind of people I want to help, because I run events myself. So, this podcast is kind of like therapy for me, where I get help and assistance on how to run the event. So please, again, leave some feedback. And secondly, obviously there's a lot of costs associated with this podcast. I've got 2 people who help me out with editing and graphics and everything else. So if you're a sponsor, possibly you're a software company who sells to the event industry, and you're interested in sponsoring this podcast, like I said, it's a top 10% podcast, please get in touch. We'd love to talk to you, dan@appsevents.com, and it'd be great to talk. So thank you very much. And now on to the interview. Hi, so welcome to the podcast. I'm talking to Liam Martin, who we spoke about 3 years ago, actually, on the podcast. Liam ran, I'm going to catch up with what he's been up to. He did, maybe still does run a conference called Running Remote in Bali, and one of the founders of Time Doctor and Staff.com. And he's also written a book about remote teams, which is something really interesting to me. So hi, Liam, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You're right. I have done all of those things, and I currently am still doing them. And the book just came out last week, which I'm very excited about. People have been getting it and kind of consuming it some of the most frustrating ways humanly possible, to be honest with you. But it's still been a really fun ride over the last week.
Cool. Well, yeah, I heard your interview on Rob Walling's podcast, Startups for the Rest of Us. And I thought it'd be good to chat again. It's interesting. I mean, this podcast has kind of gone through some changes. I mean, it was, originally we had a SaaS, which was an event system, which we sold. And honestly, I'm thinking of just in some ways making it more of a general business podcast, because I'm just not that excited about talking about events anymore. Honestly, it's like half of the people I'm talking to now are just people doing different location independent businesses. And I'm not obsessed with, having the biggest podcast in the world. I just like doing stuff I enjoy, and just talking about events was just like, it's starting to get a bit boring. So I think I'm going to rebrand it. That's kind of what I'm going to do in the next month, I think.
I think the fastest way to actually, ironically, grow your audience is to just do podcasts about things that you're truly passionate about. So exactly. I think you're exactly on the right track.
Yeah, I mean, I've got another podcast called the International Schools Podcast. That's my business. I work with international schools, and that's something I'm super interested in. And that's got really big. We're top 5% podcast. I've got a co-host now. We've got a sponsor, and it's interesting. But this podcast kind of had an agenda in the beginning. Now I don't have anything to sell, so I'm just kind of doing it to talk to interesting people. And just the events thing is just like, I mean, I love running events. It's great, but there's only so much you can talk about how someone markets and run an event. It's effectively it's just hard work. You've just got to go out, you've got to hustle, and you'll run an event. There's not. I've spoken to so many people. I don't think there's that much secret sauce about it.
Yeah. Well, I think probably the last couple of years, just in terms of that transition, has been quite interesting. So our event was going to run Austin, Texas, May of 2020, and everyone knows what happened in March of 2020. So it was it was a very quick shift. And when you're so close to that date, all of your accounts receivable have to come in, right? So you have to pay for the venue, you have to pay for the food, you have to pay for all these things. You have to at least put deposits down. And we had $250,000 invested in that project, and we had to cancel it all, which was super frustrating. But then we transitioned over to virtual, and we Johnny from Hopin. I don't know if you know Hopin.com. It's a
Yeah,
online
I've
events
heard of it.
platform.
Yeah.
Yeah. So our fund, Remote First Capital, that Andreas Klinger runs, who is a Running Remote alumnus, and he started it at the Running Remote conference. His one of his first investments was Hopin, so we used Hopin for our first event, and I mean the company is now worth, I don't know, $8 or $9 billion. It's an incredibly successful business, but he admitted to me that at that time, Running Remote was the biggest event that he had ever run on the system at
Yeah,
that
that's
point, and he
interesting.
wasn't too sure whether or not it was going to all fall apart, quite
Yeah,
honestly, while we were doing it. So it was a very interesting, exciting time for events around, the first couple quarters after COVID.
it was interesting. I mean, for us, it was crazy. I mean, I was running around 300 events a year prior to up until March
Wow.
2020, and that literally went to zero, completely went to zero. Um, and actually, if I look back now, I mean, there was some ups and downs, but now it's actually better. We've kind of transitioned. Like, we're more of a software and services company than an events company now. I mean, we've always been a Google for Education partner, working with Google for Education,
Mhm.
and now we're doing a lot of reselling Google software. We're doing a lot of support contracts, so it's recurring revenue stuff we've got into now. We never really went down the virtual event route. We did a lot of virtual training, virtual boot camps, and like Google certifications. We never went around the route of virtual conferences. We just went for, instead of that, we just put tons of free events on YouTube, which was kind of difficult in the beginning, but what it's meant is it's massively boosted our YouTube channel. So even though it's still a niche channel, but we're getting about like 60 to 80,000 views a month now. And it's all super focused Google people at schools, So what that means is like that's now getting us a pipeline of customers. So it was interesting. We didn't do the remote events. I was a bit kind of evented out, pretty quickly, and so I never did it. I think it's been successful for some people, not for others. And interestingly, now we're starting running a few events again. We're running a big one in Asia, a big one in South Korea. It's going to be in November, one in Amsterdam. But I've got no desire to go back to running anything like. I'd like to do a big European conference, a big Asian one, maybe a Middle East one, and then a few training things. But for me, COVID, in the end, like after it's all said and done, it was a good thing. We've changed the business. At the time, it was like shit, what's happening? But I'm interested. Like, did you do a virtual? You ran Running Remote as a virtual event then in COVID times?
Yeah. So when we switched around March of 2020, we went virtual, and we did. So our in-person event was about 1,000 people in Bali. That was the previous one, and a little under 1,000 people actually. And so then when COVID hit, we were doing virtual, but we did about 22,000. And it was a complete change.
22,000 paid people?
All free.
All
So
free, yeah.
what we decided to do was we said, what's the best way that we could possibly help at this point? Let's make the event free, and let's just get this information out to anyone, because the first quarter.
That's what we did with the YouTube, just all free events. So we did like 50 of them.
I just realized at that point it was a very unique situation where no one had access to this information about remote work, but everyone wanted it. So the fastest way to be able to do that would be to be able to make a free event. And looking back on it now, that was actually a mistake, because we've recognized that the new form of attendee that comes to a physical version of Running Remote, when you train someone that something is free, they're really not interested in paying for it down the road.
Sure.
And so we had a lot of people that were very loyal to our virtual events that would go to every single one of them, but wasn't willing to pay for an in-person event. And it might be because they're just, their own personal budget was, they couldn't necessarily afford it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That still kind of commits to the goals of what we wanted to put together, which was allowing people to have access to this information. But we did believe that we would have more of those attendees that would transition from a freemium model to a paid model. And we recognized that very few people were able to make that transition. And the people that ended up paying for a ticket were the people that paid for a ticket before we actually
are you running it
made it
in
free.
person? I completely understand that. Are you running it in person in Bali this year then?
The last one that we ran was about 2 months ago, and it was in Montreal, Canada. And the next
Yeah.
one that we're going to be running is in Lisbon, Portugal, because we're a
Ah,
remote company and we service remote founders. We have the conference in a different location every single year.
so I thought it was always in Bali before COVID. Is that was it?
So we did twice in Bali, just to kind of get our feet wet. So we did Ubud, which is in the middle of the
Sure, yeah.
island. Then we did the next one on the coast, which was actually right on the beach, which was a beautiful venue. The next year was going to be in Austin, Texas. The year after that, this just current year, is Montreal, Canada. And then the one that we're doing next year in April is in Lisbon, Portugal.
Got
And
it.
then we have no idea where we're going next after that. I think it really depends on whether or not we can turn a fantastic profit in Lisbon, because Montreal, we lost about 50,000 overall for that one. And that was for a conference that does about $500,000. We basically ran it at 10%.
What was the reason? You were paying too much for the venue? I mean, or marketing costs? What was the reason? Or less people came than you expected?
Think probably the biggest thing that I could kind of connect to that is we launched a little too early. If we had launched 3 months later, people would have been a lot less concerned about COVID. So as an example, we had COVID protocols, which was everyone had to wear a mask because that was what the government mandate required of us at that point. And we had a lot of people that said, I'm not interested in coming to a conference after I have to wear a mask. We had about 50 people that messaged us about that. So we don't know the exact cost that cost us, but we know if 50 people are emailing us about that are interested in buying $1,000 ticket, at least 50 people didn't come because of that particular reason. Then when it was about a month before the actual conference started, the government here removed the mask mandate. And then we announced to everyone that you will no longer be required to wear a mask. You can if you want. It's totally up to you, but you don't have to wear one. And we had about 60 people that wanted refunds off of that because they didn't necessarily feel comfortable being at a conference with hundreds and hundreds of people that weren't wearing masks. So it was kind of a like, you're killed on both sides. And what we should have done actually is just commit to one single policy. But because when you look at a government mandate, we couldn't stop anyone from taking off their mask. It would be a policy choice. It wouldn't be something that we could enforce legally. So we just realized that we were between a rock and a hard place, and we just went with what the government mandate stated.
The thing is, it's kind of silly in a way because like these government rules, because if you're at a conference, you're taking your mask off all the time. You're in the bathroom, you're eating and drinking. It's theater. The mask is just theater at this point. If you're, and people aren't wearing them properly. Most people in Canada and America don't even wear here. I live in Czech Republic mostly, and here you had to wear like the proper respirator, the whatever it is, N95. And stuff. Mm-hmm. So wearing a mask is just it might make people feel better, but it really doesn't do anything.
But it's that perception, and a lot of people committed to that perception. So regardless of whatever, I personally agree with you. However, the reality is that when you're servicing these customers, you go with what the customers want. And I don't want to necessarily change their minds. I don't want to have a debate about masks with them. I just say, hey, okay, well, if you don't want to come, that's totally
that's
fine.
why we didn't even, literally the first one, we just did an event in Florida, an internal event for a school district. And that was the first event we've done. And I just don't, I attended a couple of events last year where you had to wear a mask. We were exhibiting like trade shows, and I just hated it. It's so hard just to carry on conversations. People don't, you don't recognize a lot of people that when you're wearing a mask and everything. And whatever. If I could deal with it if I had to, but given a choice, I'd rather not. Having been to events where everyone had to wear a mask, I didn't enjoy it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think it's something that, if I had known what I had known beforehand, but because when you run a conference, and you know this better than most, you have to commit about 8 months beforehand. You have to say, here's my date, here's my venue, and I'm going to proceed. And then you just have to execute on that particular date. And you can't change your date because hundreds of people just bought flights to be able to come to, your particular location, at least in my case. And so it was so important for us to be able to figure out that timing. And I think it was just something that we got wrong. in terms
Yeah.
of understanding that timing. Again, I'm not a medical professional, so it was very difficult for me to be able to kind of look at that timing, and I realized I was probably about 90 days off. If I had done it midsummer to late summer, probably we would have had an extra 300-400 people that would have come to the
So
conference.
hard, like what just predicting even now, so I got two young children, and the whole family, we're going out to Asia next month. We're going to stay about 3.5 months. I'm attending a bunch of events in Thailand and Singapore, South Korea. We're running some stuff, meeting customers. And I still don't know what's going to happen. For example, there's a big conference, big education technology conference taking place in Hong Kong in December. Like right now, Hong Kong still has quarantine, so no one's going to go to it. They think it's going to be lifted. Or if there's a big surge while we're out in Asia, we might suddenly find ourselves in lockdown in one of these countries as well. So it's like,
For sure.
it's because there's a cycle of it gets worse in the winter and everything. So it's just life's so unpredictable, and I think now it seems life seems completely normal. I was just in Spain last week. I was just in America. Like, apart from some travel disruption, life seemed pretty normal. But I think it's gonna be a strange year or two. I think after this winter, I think could still be a bit of a return. I don't know what you think. How you think it's going to go this winter?
I know I can speak directly to the Canadian experience. The Canadian government has stated they do not want to go back to masks under any circumstances whatsoever. They said that will literally be their absolute last resort. Now, the Canadian government is famously very, very gun shy on on all of these activities. The lockdown here was quite difficult in comparison to the United States, as an example. So maybe they will actually be implementing those, and in December I'll have to wear a mask again. But I think that the current economic situation, the current global economic situation, we really can't afford to be able to go into another lockdown. I just don't think that we can afford to print another couple $1 trillion per country. It doesn't make any economic sense. And so I think that we will have to grin and bear it effectively. And that might mean that there are more deaths that occur. But actually, I read a book recently, which was super interesting, about the Spanish flu. And it was a bunch of geneticists that went back and took a look at the Spanish flu and recognized that the Spanish flu didn't disappear. It just mutated into a version that was not as severe. And the last vestiges of the Spanish flu left the United States in 1974, and it started in 1918.
It's interesting because I was reading something showing that actually if you look at the current pandemic, it's actually followed a very similar pattern to what the Spanish flu did, And I think if governments had been a bit more honest in the beginning, saying, look, these things are cyclic, they come and go in waves, then it mutates. That was never communicated to anyone. It was just like, we're going to flatten the curve. Like in the UK where I'm from, it was like, 3 months we'll flatten the curve, it'll be okay. And then people would get their hopes up. And then it was like, look, these things, I did a bit of reading pretty early, and I'm like, look, these things come in waves. Winter, it's usually worse. That's just, it's going to come and go. And people, for some reason, seem to block that out, or it wasn't communicated or something.
Yeah. So I think for us, particularly people that are running events, we have to be mindful of that, which is I would probably stay away from winter events, because you're just going to have a higher chance that there is going to be more virus kind of floating around, and people are going to be resistant towards that. I would probably say doing an event where it is more than 30 degrees Celsius is probably the best kind of, when I think about, okay, if I'm going to run an event, it has to be in a country, in a city that is got an average temperature of more than 27 degrees Celsius, as an example, because that's when that virus is just not going to be able to grab onto people in the same way that it's currently happening right now. And everyone's gotten COVID. There was a recent statistic, because in Canada, they take blood work, or not blood work, they take blood. The blood bank effectively was able to measure how many people had COVID. And they recognized that 56% of the population had the Omicron variant. So they'd been infected with the Omicron variant, 56% of the population. And the Omicron variant's been up for less than a year, right? So everyone's going to get this. To pretend that you're not going to is just not smart thinking. You need to be able to prepare your body take your vaccine so that you can be as resistant as humanly possible when it does hit you.
Yeah.
But just accept that it's going to, and then get over it and get back to your real life.
Interesting. Yeah, good point about the winter and doing events. Because yeah, I mean, as this is still at least this week, the events podcast. Like another thing I would add, very good points about hot weather and not winter. I would just look at just to reduce the risk of your event being cancelled. I would just look at different countries' responses to COVID, and like because if you're going to run it in, like for example, Canada, honestly, for me, would probably be one of the last places in the world I would run an event because I was just like, I could not believe the government's reaction.
I didn't know that 8 months before, by the way.
Like, what's that, sorry?
I didn't know that 8 months before the event ran. It's like you have to make that commitment to say,
no, but like
I was like,
what is this? Like, is this North Korea? Like, what? It's crazy, And maybe China. Obviously, I wouldn't run an event in China right now. Like, so I would be very like, I'd look to places that had like a more relaxed atmosphere, which means your event's less likely to get cancelled as well.
Well, that's why we've chosen Lisbon,
Lisbon,
to a lesser degree.
Exactly.
Lisbon is a really great location. We haven't done Europe yet. And so we really see there's 3 major blocks to our attendee base. There's Southeast Asia, there is Europe, and then there's the Americas. And so ideally, long-term, I would love to be able to actually run 3 separate events so that people can be close to those particular locations. But Lisbon offers a really unique situation because from New York to Lisbon is a 6-hour flight. It's actually a 5.5-hour flight direct. Yep. And when I looked at New York, Chicago, Montreal, Toronto, Miami, Cancun, and Los Angeles and San Francisco all have multiple dailies to Lisbon direct. So when I think about where I would want to be able to run an international conference, it's basically how big is that airport and how many direct flights are going to that particular location. Another really great opportunity is Cancun for international conferences because our attendees are very international, right? They're location independent business owners and entrepreneurs. So the more directs that you can get, Cancun is number 1. And then the second best is Istanbul in Turkey.
And Mexico was very relaxed attitude to COVID. I have some friends who were there and they really didn't change anything in their lives. It's interesting. Yeah. Acapulco, I guess, as well. There's quite a few events there, I know, as well. I think that's on the other side of the other coast, so isn't it? I haven't been to Acapulco.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely choose a location where you have low cost of living, but a really good airport. That would probably be one of the, at least for a conference like ours, that's what our location independent entrepreneurs and business owners are looking for, right? Like that's usually where they end up hanging out. And so for us, we realized perfect location, Lisbon. I went down there. I checked it out for about 2 weeks.
It's a great place.
Is it Web Summit that runs there? What's the big, huge
Web Summit is, I think it's in Barcelona. Maybe it's in Lisbon. No, Web there is one of those.
It was in Ireland before. It was in Dublin and they moved. It's the biggest tech conference in the world. Like we're talking 50,000 attendees, and they're running it in Lisbon because they recognize the infrastructure is there to be able to support that type of conference.
That's really interesting. Cool. So look, remote teams, like this is a subject close to my heart. I've been running my business for 12 years. It's been always completely remote. We have team members in the US and Europe, Thailand, Philippines, Czech Republic, US and UK are kind of the biggest ones, but and it's interesting because I guess before we get into sort of tips for running the team, like what changes have you seen in like the remote work teams? I was very early in the digital nomad scene, and now I've got kids. We still travel a lot, but we'll do longer trips away, and obviously if they're not at full-time school yet, not 6 yet, so I've already had a change. But what have you seen? Like what's your sort of travel schedule? What changes have you seen in the whole nomadic scene, and how has it been impacted by all these millions and millions of remote workers who've suddenly had regular jobs who were allowed to work remotely?
Sure. So I've coined this as the age of the rich dumb nomad that is currently happening right now. So February of 2020, 4% of the US workforce was working remotely, and by March that was 45% of the US workforce. So complete shift of everything that you can think about as it applies to work, right? That's the biggest transition in work since the Industrial Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution took 80 years and we did that in March. Current numbers today are still about 35% of the US workforce is working remote or hybrid at this point. So those numbers have actually not really dropped off. If you look at Google had a fantastic data set because everyone has their smartphones, right? Everyone has an Android device, and they were tracking how often you'd go on public transportation, how often you would go to parks, how often you would go to the grocery store, right? They'd be able to collect that data on an anonymous basis. They actually pulled the data set because people were terrified, saying, "What do you mean you're tracking where I'm going?" Of course they are. Come on,
like, of course, yeah.
That's a fantastic data set, and the one that has had the least reduction out of all of those categories has been workplace behavior. So we're not changing. I would probably project that 25% of the US workforce will be working remotely within the next year. And I think that we're probably going to go up to about 50% of the US workforce working remotely within the next 5 years. So that curve is now currently going right back up. So we kind of hit.
But if you say level. If you say remote or hybrid, I mean, if someone's hybrid, they still have to live near the office, though, don't they? Like if it's hybrid, they can't go and live.
Exactly right. So the majority are hybrid because I think it's actually a waiting room for the employer making a decision. Am I going to go back to the office completely or am I going to go remote? However, it looks to me, based off the data that I'm seeing, the vast majority of workers are interested in remote work and they're not interested in office work. That's actually the number one reason due to the Great Resignation. A lot of other kind of data sets will kind of pretend that it's not, but that is the number one reason is remote work. So you've also seen a huge change in the digital nomad scene during that time. So pre-COVID, there were probably about 5 million digital nomads traveling internationally. A lot of people will say that it was much bigger than that, but it's not really. There's a lot of good data sets. McKinsey has a really good one. Just Google McKinsey digital nomadism and you'll be able to find it.
I'll check it out.
So now we're probably floating around 50 million. And I would probably say we'd be at $250 million within the next 5 years. And the biggest group of people that are leaving are remote work, digital workers. So people that have a desk, right? But they don't actually have a desk anymore because they're now digital nomads. Yeah. And they are relatively high net worth individuals. So people that are making more than $100,000 per year. Yeah. As opposed to the previous generation of digital nomads that on average, I don't know if maybe this is an interesting pop quiz for you. What do you think the average income of a digital nomad was in 2019?
2019, that's interesting because, based on what you said, I would say it's low. I mean, it's so difficult to say, though, because you meet such a variety of people. You meet a lot of people doing their startup. Maybe they're doing an agency or some web design and they're making, say, $20,000 a year. And then you meet a lot of people who are making, 200,000, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 a year. So I guess it's going to be lower than the number you said. So I'm going to guess like 30,000, 40,000.
15,300.
Wow. Okay. But I guess, that's the great thing about starting up a business. If you're living in Chiang Mai or Bali, you can get by on that money. You can rent a cheap apartment.
Absolutely. But that was probably a major barrier towards those costs remaining low. Yeah. Right. You can go to Chiang Mai and you can get a $400 a month condo. Yeah. With a pool and, you can pay $100 in food and you can have someone that comes in and cleans your place for an extra $50 a month. And you're doing fantastic, right? You're living. You
have a lifestyle of a rich person, basically.
Yeah, $600 or $700 per month. Yeah. That number will change and is currently changing very, very quickly. In Bali, which is where I spend a lot of my time as a digital nomad, the price of property has just in the last 6 months effectively doubled, which is just kind of pushing out a lot of the locals. So it's making it completely unaffordable for locals to be able to interact with those groups of people.
Well, I can give you some live data. It's interesting because I'm just like literally I was doing it before I started the call with you. So we're going to be in Thailand and South Korea, but we're going to be in Thailand for the first 6 weeks. I'm looking at booking an Airbnb, 2 bedrooms. We've got 2 kids. We booked an Airbnb in 2019 in Thailand. Similar time of the year, almost exactly the same time of year. I think we paid like $1,500, and that's for like a nice 2-bedroom Airbnb. Like,
Right.
you know, a good place, nice development, good area, and near where I want to be. Nothing under 3,500 for that same type of apartment right now. You know, like a nice 2-bedroom. You could get a really crappy one, but like it's more than doubled in a 3-year period in Bangkok.
Yeah.
And
So,
that's a country that's been tourism's been decimated. You would think, you know, they would be desperate to get people back, but the prices are crazy.
well, they're recognizing that you just can't create more houses, within
Yeah,
6 months. And there's a huge influx of people. I have a lot of friends of mine that, and the policy right now is don't ask, don't tell, like the U.S. military with regards to gay recruits. Uh, there are remote workers that work for companies that you would probably know.
yeah,
That if I said who they were, I would get in trouble. But they work in San Francisco, quote unquote, but they're not in San Francisco.
sure.
They're in Medellin, they're in Cancun, they're in Tulum. Some of them are in Bali, and they fly back once a month to be able to say, yes, I am qualified I am still living here, right? Because they require that one flight back per month to be able to make sure that they're tax compliant.
Yeah, I
So
wonder how big that is. I would guess it's very common people doing something like that.
for anyone that's making over $200,000 per year, which is probably the average salary that I'm seeing of these people, and these we're talking not just, we're talking 1%ers, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about US 1%ers. And so they're recognizing I'm now free to be able to do these things. And it's an incredibly exciting time because these people were paying $8,000 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco, and they're now paying $2,000 a month for a 4-bedroom villa in Bali with a maid, right? So their life has completely changed.
Do you think though these particularly these Americans, tech people earning like the example you gave, 200,000 a year? Do you think though, given type this, they may be shooting themselves in the foot? Because I wonder if a lot of American companies now are going to realize what I realized a long time ago is like, why didn't I go to the Philippines and hire? Like, and if there's a lot of people now. I mean, I know, Dan and Ian who run Dynamite Jobs. I don't know if you know them.
Yep.
I was just with them in Barcelona last week, actually. I mean, they're seeing a huge amount of people recruiting coders from Argentina and Brazil now. I mean, people have been recruiting from Eastern Europe for quite a while. I mean, do you think that a lot of what these people are not thinking is that maybe companies are going to start? I don't want the high maintenance Americans. I would rather have a hardworking, person from Argentina.
Yeah, no, and that's definitely happening. We're personally getting hammered by Meta almost weekly. We've lost 4 of our staff to Meta because Meta did not have a remote work hiring policy pre-pandemic. Now they're stating 75% of their workforce will be working remotely within the next 5 years. So that's their target, right? So they are effectively a remote first company at this point.
I think you have to go in a couple of days a week there, don't you, right now? Something like that. There's some path, something happening like that.
Yeah, so that's mostly due to tax compliance. So for anyone that's kind of confused as to why do you have to show up once a month? It's to be able to make sure that you're still tax compliant to say, I am a resident of California, which has 12.5% state tax for income tax, right? So they want to make sure that they are saying that individual is still compliant.
Right.
And then outside of that, it's a don't ask, don't tell policy, right? So as long as they've qualified the requirements saying, hey, I'm working remotely and I am still a resident of the state of California, they don't really care. Right. But the situation right now is actually pretty intense. I think we're going to see a huge transition in terms of digital nomadism. I bought property during the pandemic. I bought a co-working space during the pandemic because and completely had to cash flow it for a year and a half because I realized the coming wave of all of these digital nomads that are going to absolutely love working remotely and are not going to want to go back and are making $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year. Like the average engineer at Google makes $375,000.
Yeah.
Right. So and right now, 67% of engineers, computer engineers, currently work remotely today. Right. Yeah. So why do they want to live in San Francisco when they could live in Medellin as an example, and get a much better lifestyle.
Sure.
They still live with their expat community. They're loving what they're doing, but they're not interacting. And I don't know the data enough to be able to really look at this in a deeper way, but I believe they will not interact with the digital nomad 2.0, which is, there's kind of like three waves. Digital nomad 1.0 was engineers, very beginning, making $100,000 per year. Very small community of people, mostly engineers, saying, hey, we can work remotely and we can be digital nomads. All right, that was the first version. The second version was the agency, social media guys, SEO guys, starting my own hustle, starting my Shopify store. That was version 2.0. That was the $15,000 per year person that was like, I'm not making any money at all, but I'm happy. I don't have kids. You know, my lifestyle's pretty good, and on $15,000 a year, I can survive.
Yeah.
Version 3.0 is going to be the $200,000 average salary person that says, I'm not staying in a hostel. I make 200 grand a year. I'm going to build a massive villa somewhere in Bali, and that's what I'm going to do with my time. And those, I think we're entering that third stage now. We're effectively already in it. If you go down to Tulum right now, it's probably a really good microcosm of what's currently happening, because COVID was Tulum was relatively open during COVID. So a lot of those individuals went down there as their first location. And the cost of a home went from, I have a friend of mine that ended up he had a 4-bedroom villa that he bought for $150,000. That same villa is worth $1.5 million.
That's
right
crazy,
now.
isn't it?
So a complete change to everything that you want to think about as it applies to remote work and digital nomadism. And that's only going to go up. I think probably by next summer, you'll probably see, and actually more specifically this winter, you'll probably see the first real open season where people are saying, I don't want to be here in Canada, as an example, in minus 35-degree weather. I would rather go to Tulum and live the good life.
Definitely. What so we haven't talked about your book yet, but so we've talked about a lot of other interesting stuff as well. In terms of remote, like, I mean, what obviously you run, so what, like, can we just but actually before that, can we just go over again your entrepreneurial stuff? Because I know timedoctor.com was what you were doing before, and I believe you're still that's still your business. And has it grown a lot since we last spoke?
Well, we spoke about 3 years ago, so yes, it has grown since then. COVID was definitely quite successful for the entire remote technology stack.
Yeah.
So Time Doctor is a remote time tracking tool, specifically time tracking for remote workers. And so that grew along with Mural and Loom and project management systems, Zoom, all these companies really kind of pushed out of the mean tracking curve. Shopify is another great example of a company that just completely exploded because everyone went online. Effectively, the digitization of the economy.
Yeah.
And so right now, we're probably all returning to the mean. So I think everyone's growth isn't as aggressive as it was back in 2020. I was doing first couple weeks of COVID. A big customer of mine would be 200, 300, 400 people, as an example. And you can run your own calculations on that. $10 per user per month type of contract. We're talking about a $50,000 to $100,000 a year contract, right? That would be a big client for us. And now we have governments that run on our technology, right? We have massive corporations that run on our technology. And so one of the big reasons as to why I wrote the book was that during those first couple months, there were people that were coming to me saying, I have 500,000 workers in my organization. I have no idea how to be able to take them remote. How do I do it? And I'd say, well, I have no idea because we have 150 people here. And they'd say, well, you're the first person that I've been able to talk to that actually has experience working remotely before the pandemic, right? There was a massive information gap that was occurring in this kind of vacuum space. So I realized that this book, Running Remote, was really the goal that I put together for myself, saying, I want to be able to put together a package to show people the operating system of how to run remotely. Because the vast majority of people just recreated the office remote. And that's
Yeah.
not remote work. There's an actual methodology to it. There's a system to it. So I took all of these remote work pioneers, everyone that was remote before the pandemic and incredibly successful, 8-9-figure tech entrepreneurs and operators. And I interviewed them and I said, well, what do you all have in common? And they came to one single conclusion, which was asynchronous management, which is the ability to be able to manage people without directly interacting with them simultaneously.
You're speaking
No
to
one,
the converted on this one.
yeah, well, no one really saw that methodology. I've spoken at many different conferences over the last couple months about asynchronous work, and I'd see about 90% of the audience has this kind of weird look on their face, like, what do you mean you're not going to actually talk to your people? It's not that we don't talk to them, we communicate with them differently. We try to maximize asynchronous communication and minimize synchronous communication in order for the organization to be able to run a lot more efficiently. And so this is the methodology that successful remote companies use. And there's been no book about that. There's a whole bunch of books about whether or not you should use Slack or Zoom or Skype. And if those are the questions that you think will solve your problems, then you don't actually know what your real problem is. And this book specifically addresses that issue.
Please, not Slack. Slack is the devil as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I know a lot of people love it, but I mean, I used it once for 2 months and I honestly had anxiety. It gave me anxiety. I'm like, this is a terrible system. All these constant, just checking constant messages. Like, I don't know, maybe you like it. That's an interesting thing. I know Slack is, people
the
love
way
it.
that we use it,
I cannot stand it. I could never use it.
Yeah, we remove all notifications. So standard Slack deployment is you no longer have a notification that pushes to your computer in any way.
Yeah.
And the only notification that I will get is for a particular keyword, which is called Liam Emergency. So if anyone puts in @Liam Emergency, I'll get that push notification.
Sure, that's a good idea.
And that significantly reduces, I mean, we go from, 500 pings a day to 1 ping a month. And it's the only ping that I should really actually pay attention to because it's an emergency and I need to be able to address it. And so you're right. It does create a lot of anxiety. I mean, Zoom fatigue is real. A lot of people that kind of have these perspectives of, hey, let's be on Zoom 8 hours a day is mentally draining for the vast majority of the population. And so there is a better way of doing it. It's called asynchronous management. And that's what we teach in the book.
Interesting. I mean, because how I am, I don't think I'm the only person who's like this. I hate meetings with pathologically. I mean, I'm glad that I'm a business owner, so I can some way set the culture. But like, I have one fixed meeting a week, which is with my whole team. And honestly, I shouldn't say this because I mean, I love my team, but I dread that meeting. I'm like, oh, it just fills me with misery. And that's only one. And I do have other meetings. This is kind of a meeting we're on a call, but I tend to do things I enjoy. But I just hate meetings. So this whole asynchronous movement, anything that can reduce having to have a meeting. I think the main reason I don't like it is such a massive disruption in my day. If I'm talking to someone at 3 PM, then it's not just that hour that's gone. It's like the build up. I can't get into something else that I would have done. I can't block off 3 or 4 hours. And did you see a lot of people have similar feelings to me about meetings?
Well, we have something called silent meetings that we talk about in the book, which is a standing meeting, let's say a weekly meeting. We will have issues that we put into our project management system. We use Asana. Yeah. And if we have less than 3 issues going into a meeting, we automatically cancel the meeting. So there's basically just a Zapier zap that just automatically cancels the meeting because
that's great.
There's not enough information in order for us to be able to have meaningful conversations about that particular issue. And that is incredibly powerful for us because it allows for, so number one, any meeting that doesn't have an agenda, do not attend. Yeah. That's one of my golden rules. Any weekly meeting, if there are no issues around that weekly meeting, or there are issues that don't necessarily concern me, do not attend. There's a bunch of those kind of like if-then statements that I have in my life and that I encourage all of our team members to be able to follow as well. Another one is if you're in a meeting and you realize that the meeting is invaluable to you, you don't need to announce that you're leaving the meeting, just leave. Just leave the call. And some people find that quite jarring.
But what about if someone was about to ask you a question or about to give something to you, and you've gone?
And get your shit together and talk to me about it beforehand and give me an agenda. Sure. If I'm going to participate, let me know. But if I'm not going to participate, there's no real point to me being there. And for these meetings, we usually record them, and then we'll be able to put that recording up so that anyone that isn't attending can actually watch it at 2x speed, which is way more efficient than what, you know, you've probably been in these meetings. Maybe your weekly meeting is like this: 8 or 9 people in a room, 2 people talking for 60 minutes, and the other 7 people talk for 5 minutes, and then the meeting's over, right? That's just, you've wasted those other 7 people's time. You could have had a 2-person conversation, recorded it, pulled out the minutes, and then given that piece of information to everyone in the team.
Yeah, definitely. I'm getting much more into. I mean, we're Google, you know, so we use Meet instead of Zoom. But recording the meetings is so good. I mean, for example, you know, when we've got to demo something technical with Google, just if you record it, then you don't need to explain it again to someone else. You've just got that video. You just send them the link, and that's becoming much more common, I think. I mean, Loom was obviously a big, you know, a lot of people started using Loom as well, which really helped that.
Yeah, I know for me, the ability to just communicate more effectively, the technology stack has gotten significantly better over the last, well, even the last 3 years, where you can use tools like Loom to effectively present. And they talk about how a picture's worth 1,000 words. A Loom is worth like 10 million, because you can actually bring people through the entire process from beginning to end on your computer, and then you can send that piece of information to anyone. And so for me, these tools are only becoming easier to be able to implement. But the basis of that entire conversation, the premise that you need to be able to recognize, is that the more that you minimize synchronous interruptions throughout your organization's workday, the more deep work that you can focus on. And the more deep work your organization can focus on, the faster your organization will move. And it's somewhat counterintuitive. This is a top-down issue. So the people at the top are the ones that really have to implement this type of policy, because if the boss is asking you for an emergency meeting, then it creates a problem where that kind of feeds down the entire chain. But if you can actually accomplish that, you're going to be way more productive. Your organization is going to move much, much faster. You just need to actually implement it. And that's the point of this book, is specifically focusing on that methodology and how to deploy it at scale.
Interesting. You know, I love having people on different time zones. I know some people find it a hassle, but I actually prefer it because it minimizes the overlap. And it's actually, like, for example, I work with quite a few people in Asia. My business partner, actually, he's in Thailand. So we have maybe, you know, 3, 4, 5 hours maximum we overlap. That restricts, like, I know when it gets to like 1 PM, he's offline. He's not going to contact me again. So it just makes, if we're going to speak, if we have to speak synchronously, it just reduces the window and it gets done quickly, you know? So I actually find that the time zones help, you know, because it just reduces the amount of time you ever can talk to each other, you know? And so it makes you do more asynchronous tasks, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually have like a communication pyramid, which is, in-person is better than video. Video is better than audio. Audio is better than instant messaging, and instant messaging is better than email. But as you move down the chain, you're more asynchronous. So the bottom of your pyramid should really be email, then project management. And then if you can, I should put it in between space, which is synchronous video, like Looms, as an example. Then you should go into instant messaging. Then you should go into video, or audio, video, and then in person, right? So that's the absolute tippy top of your pyramid.
That's really, really good. What I'm curious about your, like, the nuts and bolts, like your company. What is your tech stack? I mean, you mentioned Asana, you mentioned using Zoom and Slack. What a system? Can you walk through like what systems you use? And because obviously you're very, you know, forward thinking in terms of remote work. What have you found good, and which do you like, and is there any you'd get rid of?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's always something that we would get rid of, to be honest with you. Google Apps for Business, that's probably the absolute core of what we're using. These project management systems like Asana, Trello, collaboration tools like Stormboard, Mural, those types of things. We use a tool called 1Password, which is our email password tool that provides ciphers for passwords as opposed to the direct password. So what you can do for that is you can issue a 1Password account to an employee, and then instead of changing all of your passwords, you can simply remove their access to 1Password, because they never actually knew what the real passwords were in the first place. It's a cipher continuously for them. So they don't know what the real password is, which is super cost efficient.
That's really
We do
good
use
stuff.
Slack as an example, which is a great tool for that instant communication. But again, as long as you use it properly, we use stuff like Zoom, as you had said before, Time Doctor, obviously, for time tracking for a remote team. And then even something like speed tests, right? So even when someone comes on to be able to join the company, they need to be able to run a speed test. And if you have less than 5 down and 5 up with a ping of above 30, you're not allowed to be able to work in the company. You have to go find better internet somewhere
That's
else.
interesting. Why do you use a Zoom when you've got like Meet included in your Google Workspace?
Stability. So generally with Google Meet, there's 2 issues. Number one, Google Meet is actually a paid product in the United States, but then outside of the United States, it's a free product. So everyone uses it for free out of the US, but then inside of the US, it's paid. And if you are logging in from outside of a Google Meet event, like if you're an American, you actually have to technically pay for the product. There is a kind of a workaround to be able to get to it, but that's incredibly frustrating. So we just use Zoom, and it's a more stable product, and we got a really good deal with them because we were one of the first companies to be able to use the tech.
You should look. I mean, obviously, you know, I'm a Google fanboy, but it has changed now. I mean, anyone with a Gmail account can join in fact, you can even give a Meet link to anyone. They don't even need a Google account, and they can join. And actually, and it's kind of this paid and free tiers, but like anyone can join a Meet, literally. And I've noticed, because I know a few of the technical team who've been working on this, and like the last 3 months, the quality's got really good. I would say it's comparable. We actually did one of the projects we did for Google was a website called comparemeet.com, which is for them to compare Zoom and Meet features. Yeah, I'm not trying to persuade you, but I think it's for a lot of people who are paying for Zoom. They could stop the subscription and just do Meet nowadays.
Yeah, I think the other part of this too is when you make an initial decision on a piece of technology like that, it's very, very difficult to be able to uproot it from your technology stack.
Sure.
So once you're in, and you've got a couple hundred people using it, to be able to pull that away from people, just even like as an example, it's integrated inside of my Calendly, right?
Yeah.
So automatically when someone sends me when I send them a Calendly link, it just automatically creates a Zoom room for us to be able to do it. All of those little integrations need to be changed around. And sometimes it's not so much about, is the technology better, but it has to be exponentially better in order for us to be able to go through the pain of switching. And I think that's a real great advantage for the companies that first enter the ring, because they have that first mover advantage.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, for me, I have a similar philosophy. Only for me, like to do something outside of Google, like it has to be exponentially better. Like for example, you know, we didn't even have a CRM for a long time. You know, now we use Pipedrive, which is amazing. But I just kept it on a spreadsheet, so it was doable. You know, Google Sheet, and it just got too ridiculous. You know, but like Calendly, for example, Google now has appointment scheduling links you create.
Yes.
I've got one for a 20-minute one for a 60-minute one. So like I've got rid of Calendly, I've got rid of Zoom just with the new, you know, Google's they realized at the start of a pandemic, they were like, hang on a minute, who's this Zoom and why are they suddenly taking over our market, you know? And it made them improve it. They were like a year too slow to really get Meet up there, you know. Now I think it's really getting good.
Yeah, I've seen it's a really interesting, because Tope is a friend of mine from Calendly, and I've always told him, dude, I feel like you're a feature. You're not an app, right? And it's an app that we've paid for, that I pay for.
Yeah.
But you're right. I did actually, my assistant showed me the Google Meet calendar tool, and the Google Calendar like meeting tool. Yeah. And it looks great. So I'm going to test it out, because if that can remove $7 per user per month out of, you know, my bottom line, it's only a matter of time before we would make that particular switch. So it's interesting. I mean, I think the entire remote technology stack is really heating up. Everyone has raised, you know, if you're anything connected to the remote tech stack, you've raised $100 million. If you're someone that just started in the last couple of years, as opposed to old school guys like me that are still bootstrapped. But the space is getting very, very hot very quickly, and it will only continue to do so as we see the continued transition of everyone going to a remote first mindset.
Definitely. Liam, look, that's a really great way to finish it. Everyone check out the book, Running Remote. I have to admit, I haven't read it. I listened to your interview on Startups for the Rest of Us of Rob Walling. I've just ordered it on Amazon before we spoke, so I'm going to let you know when I've had to go through it. But
Awesome.
it looks really interesting, and I'm glad you speak to a lot of other people. It's always good to get a bunch of people's perspective, and you know better than most, I guess, who's doing well with the remote work and who isn't.
Yeah, the book is not actually just my interpretation of remote work. It is all of these other experts. I thought, what's the advantage that I have? I've probably spoken to more remote work experts than anyone on planet Earth. So assembling those people, putting them into a book is what this is about. And it just happened to result in understanding this methodology, this operating system on running remote work, which I'm calling asynchronous management. So that's what the book's about.
That's good. Well, I'll put a link to Amazon, or would you rather have a link to the website? Would people buy direct Amazon, or you don't care?
Doesn't matter. Any way that you can consume the book. I mean, everyone's getting it on audiobook right now, which doesn't count towards like Wall Street Journal rankings or anything like that. But that's totally fine. Any way that you want to consume it, just go for it.
Sounds good. All the best, Liam. Thanks for talking today.
Thank you.